Lena, a young girl with curly dark hair and bright eyes, sat on the old wooden swing at the neighborhood playground. This was her favorite spot, where she could kick her feet high and imagine herself soaring into the sky. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the park, making everything shimmer with a warm light. Children's laughter filled the air as friends chased each other, shouting playful taunts and giggles that echoed through the space. Robbie, Lena's best friend with sandy blonde hair and a mischievous smile, used to run alongside her, sharing the same laughter and carefree joy. But lately, things had changed. Lena glanced at him now, standing on the other side of the playground, his eyes darting away when she tried to meet his gaze. The hurt was sharp, like a pebble lodged in her shoe that she couldn't shake out. Marianne, Robbie's mother, stood nearby, her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention without a word, her icy stare enough to chill the warmest afternoon. Lena had grown used to that look, though she never understood why it was aimed at her. The other children continued to play, unaware of the silent tension that crackled between Marianne and Lena. But Lena felt it, as heavy as the swing chains she gripped. The playground had once been Lena's refuge, a place where she could be herself without fear. But as the days passed, she felt the shifts like tremors beneath her feet. Robbie began to avoid her at school, choosing different partners for group activities and ducking away when their eyes met in the hallway. Lena watched him laugh with others, the sound once so familiar, now strange and distant. Marianne's influence seeped into the playground like an invisible poison. Other parents started to mimic her behavior, casting suspicious glances Lena's way. When Lena tried to join a game of tag, a girl named Emily, who used to wave her over without hesitation, suddenly shook her head and turned away. The rejection stung, worse than any scraped knee Lena had ever had. Her parents, David and Elena, were loving but busy. David, a federal judge known for his fairness and strong sense of justice, often came home late, his brows furrowed from long days of deliberation. Elena managed their household with grace, always making time for Lena, but never prying too much when Lena came home with a cloud over her face. Lena wished she could tell them everything, but she didn't know how to explain something that felt as big as a storm, yet as small as a whisper. Lena sat in her room, the soft glow of her reading lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The quiet hum of her parents talking downstairs was comforting, but it didn't chase away the loneliness that gnawed at her. She thought back to the way Robbie had laughed earlier that day, playing kickball without so much as a glance in her direction. It was as if their friendship had evaporated into the thin air of the playground, leaving only the sting of absence behind. She drew her knees to her chest, feeling the tears threaten but willing them back. She couldn't tell her parents, not when they had so much on their plates already. Her father's words often rang in her ears. "Stand up for yourself, Lena. You're strong." But how could she stand up to something she couldn't name? The following day at the playground, Lena pushed herself to go, to reclaim a piece of her sanctuary. She sat on the swing, feeling the cold metal bite into her palms. Marianne stood nearby, chatting with another parent, her eyes flicking to Lena with a gaze sharp as glass. Robbie, standing a few feet away, glanced her way for a fleeting moment before turning back to the game. The silent wall between them felt higher than ever, and Lena knew one thing for sure. The playground was no longer the same. Lena sat on her bed, staring out at the orange and purple hues of the evening sky. She could still hear Marianne's voice echoing in her head, sharp and dismissive, as if her words had the power to push Lena to the edges of the playground. But today was different. Today, Lena felt a spark of defiance deep in her chest. The next afternoon, Lena stood at the edge of the playground, the metal fence cool against her back. Her eyes found Robbie first. He was kicking a ball with the other kids, his laughter mingling with theirs. Marianne's voice cut through the noise, calling Robbie over to her side. The boy's smile faltered, and Lena felt the pang of their shared silence. Marianne turned, eyes narrowing as they met Lena's. "What did I say about you coming here?" she said, her voice loud enough for nearby parents to pause mid-conversation. The chatter quieted, and Lena felt every eye on her. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else," Lena said, her voice trembling but determined. The silence was complete. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marianne's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment Lena thought she saw doubt flicker there. The pause didn't last long. Marianne's lips pressed into a thin, harsh line. "Get out of here," she said, pointing to the park entrance. The command was cold, final, and laced with disdain. Lena's knees wobbled, but she stood her ground. "No." The tension snapped as Marianne stepped closer, eyes blazing. Lena's heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Before anything more could happen, a voice called out from behind her. "Lena!" It was her mother, Elena, striding across the playground with eyes full of concern. The spell was broken. Marianne retreated, her gaze darting away. Lena felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. The confrontation was over, but the sting of it clung to her like a cold wind. Back home, Lena sat at the kitchen table, tracing the pattern of the wood with her finger. Her mother placed a warm cup of tea in front of her and sat down, eyes searching Lena's face. "What happened, sweetheart?" Elena's voice was gentle but firm, the voice Lena always associated with home and safety. Lena hesitated. The words were tangled in her chest, heavy and hard to untangle. "Marianne doesn't want me at the playground. She says I don't belong." Elena's eyes flashed, but she kept her voice steady. "You do belong, Lena, and we'll make sure she knows that." David came home shortly after, his expression shifting from exhaustion to concern as he listened to Lena's story. His jaw clenched as Lena described the way Marianne spoke to her, the way the other kids had started avoiding her, as if they feared being caught in the crossfire. "Enough is enough," he said, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "We're going to handle this." The next day, Lena felt a sense of trepidation as she walked to the playground with her parents. The park was buzzing with families, kids laughing and parents talking in low murmurs. Lena spotted Marianne, who stiffened at the sight of them. David walked up to Marianne, his posture strong and composed. "Marianne," he said, his tone formal and measured, "we need to talk." The other parents fell silent, curiosity piqued. Marianne crossed her arms, eyes darting to the gathering crowd. "There's nothing to discuss," she replied, her voice taut. David's expression didn't change. "There's everything to discuss when it comes to how my daughter is treated." The conversation that followed was short but powerful. David made it clear that discrimination wouldn't be tolerated, that Lena had every right to play where she chose. The parents around them exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Marianne's face reddened, and for the first time, Lena saw a crack in her rigid demeanor. She turned abruptly and walked away without another word. The crowd dispersed slowly, and Robbie looked at Lena from across the playground, his eyes full of something she couldn't quite read. Guilt, maybe. The next few days saw a subtle change. Some parents who once sided with Marianne kept their distance, while others greeted Lena and her family with cautious smiles. Robbie, caught between his mother's influence and his own sense of right and wrong, lingered nearby, watching Lena but saying nothing. Lena's confidence grew as she realized she wasn't alone. Her father's firm stance and the presence of her mother by her side gave her hope. The playground, once a battlefield, was beginning to feel like a place where she could find her footing again. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Lena returned to the playground each afternoon, determined not to let Marianne's influence keep her away. Robbie was always there, watching her with conflicted eyes, but never approaching. One day, Lena sat on the swing, pushing herself gently and feeling the cool breeze on her face. The sky was a soft blue, speckled with clouds that drifted lazily. The scene was peaceful until Marianne arrived. Her eyes met Lena's, and the warm afternoon seemed to chill. "Robbie!" Marianne called, her voice cutting through the air. Robbie looked up from where he was playing with a group of boys, his face tightening. "Mom?" he replied, unsure. Marianne's gaze shifted to Lena, her disapproval palpable. "Come here now," she said. Robbie obeyed, moving toward his mother but glancing at Lena, regret shadowing his features. "You're still here?" Marianne said to Lena, her voice cold. This time, other parents were watching more closely. The playground felt like a stage, every eye trained on the confrontation. Lena's chest tightened, but she straightened her back. "I have every right to be here," she said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded like a drum. The playground seemed to hold its breath. Marianne's face darkened, and before Lena could react, Marianne took a step forward and shoved her shoulder. Lena stumbled but caught herself, eyes wide with shock. The silence was deafening. Before anyone could move, a voice broke through the tension. "Enough!" David's voice rang out, strong and unwavering. He stood at the playground entrance, eyes locked on Marianne, with a look that sent a shiver through the crowd. Elena was beside him, her expression a mixture of anger and protectiveness. The playground was still, the tension shattered as murmurs rippled through the watching parents. David approached Lena, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder before turning to Marianne. "We need to talk about your behavior," he said, his tone authoritative. Marianne's face flushed as she met the eyes of the other parents, some of whom shook their heads in disapproval. Elena knelt in front of Lena, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Lena nodded, tears pricking the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, not wanting to show weakness. The parents watched as David, still calm, but with an edge of steel in his voice, spoke to Marianne. "Your treatment of my daughter stops now. This community deserves better than this, and Lena deserves better." Marianne's expression faltered, and for a moment, the woman who seemed so immovable looked unsure. She glanced at Robbie, who stood with his head down, fists clenched at his sides. "I'm sorry," a small voice said. It was Robbie. He looked up at Lena, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Lena." The crowd's murmuring grew louder as Marianne's composure cracked. Without another word, she turned and left the playground, her son trailing behind her. A few parents exchanged looks, whispers of change passing through them. Back at home, Lena sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket while her parents discussed what had happened. The quiet hum of their voices brought her comfort, but she couldn't shake the nervous energy that still buzzed through her. Elena sat beside her, pulling Lena into a gentle hug. "We're proud of you, sweetheart," she said. "You were brave today." David nodded, his expression serious. "This isn't over. We're going to make sure Marianne's behavior is addressed properly." His words were calm but decisive, filling Lena with a sense of reassurance she hadn't felt in weeks. The following day, David called a meeting with the neighborhood committee. Lena's story was shared, and other parents who had witnessed the playground incident came forward, agreeing that the toxic behavior needed to be confronted. The conversation was not just about Lena, but about setting a precedent for how everyone in the community should be treated. The outcome was swift. Marianne was removed from her position on the committee and given a clear warning that her actions would not be tolerated. The news spread quickly, and although the playground was still the same, it felt different to Lena. The invisible walls that had kept her apart from the other children were starting to crumble. The next time Lena went to the playground, she was greeted by a few familiar smiles. Parents who once kept their distance nodded in acknowledgement. Robbie stood near the swings, alone and looking nervous. Lena felt a mix of emotions: relief, lingering hurt, and a cautious hope. Robbie approached, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded, crossing her arms. "Okay, I'm really sorry," Robbie said, eyes locked on the ground. "I didn't know what to do. Mom, she was so strict, and I didn't want to get in trouble. But it wasn't right." Lena took a deep breath. The words that once felt heavy and impossible to say now came easily. "I missed you, Robbie, but what happened hurt." "I know," Robbie replied, looking up with tearful eyes. "I want to make it better." A small, tentative smile tugged at Lena's lips. "It'll take time," she said, feeling the weight that had pressed down on her lift slightly. Robbie nodded, understanding in his expression. Lena walked through the playground, feeling the crunch of leaves under her sneakers. The air was cool, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows that stretched across the grass. The sounds of children laughing and playing surrounded her, no longer tinged with the loneliness she had grown accustomed to. Robbie stood by the monkey bars, his eyes tracking her movements. "Hey," he said, stepping forward. His voice was still uncertain, but there was a sincerity that hadn't been there before. "Hey," Lena replied, a small smile breaking across her face. For the first time in a long while, she felt the tension ease. Robbie glanced over his shoulder at the other kids who were playing a game of tag. They were watching, some with curiosity, others with silent approval. "Want to play?" Robbie asked, gesturing to the group. Lena hesitated for a moment, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves. But then she looked around and saw that no one was whispering or casting disapproving glances. The atmosphere felt different, lighter. "Yeah," Lena said, nodding. Robbie's face brightened, and he reached out to pull her into the game. They chased each other, laughter spilling out as they zigzagged through the playground. For the first time in weeks, Lena felt the weight of isolation lift, replaced by the simple joy of belonging. The days turned into weeks, and Lena's place at the playground became more secure. Marianne no longer appeared, and the shadow she had cast over the park seemed to dissipate with her absence. Lena began to feel more at ease, her smile coming more naturally. Some of the other parents who had once been hesitant now nodded at her parents, offering kind words and encouragement. One afternoon, Lena sat on the swing, the chains creaking as she pushed herself gently. Robbie sat on the swing next to hers, their silence companionable. "I'm glad you're back," he said after a while, not meeting her eyes. "Me too," Lena said, kicking her feet lightly. "I missed this." Robbie glanced at her, a hint of a smile on his face. "Do you think things will ever be the same as before?" he asked, a touch of hope in his voice. Lena thought for a moment. The pain of what had happened was still there, like a bruise that hadn't fully faded. But it was getting better. "Maybe not exactly the same," she said, "but we can make it better." Robbie nodded, understanding what she meant. They didn't need to go back to how things were. They could move forward, stronger and wiser. The seasons shifted, and the playground began to transform with the changing weather. The trees that once held bright green leaves were now a cascade of red, orange, and yellow. Lena's parents watched from the bench, their eyes following their daughter as she played and laughed with her friends. David turned to Elena, a look of pride on his face. "She's stronger than I realized," he said softly. Elena smiled, squeezing his hand. "She gets that from you." The days of tension were behind them, but the lessons lingered. David had taken steps to ensure that what had happened to Lena wouldn't happen to any other child. The community had come together, holding meetings that opened conversations about acceptance, kindness, and the importance of standing up for what was right. One crisp morning, Lena sat at the dining table finishing her homework. The light from the window cast a warm glow across the room. David entered, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "There's a meeting at the park later," he said. "The neighborhood is setting up a new committee to make sure everyone feels welcome. Your mother and I thought you might like to come." Lena's eyes widened, and she nodded. "Can I say something at the meeting?" she asked, a mixture of nerves and excitement bubbling inside her. David's smile widened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Of course. Your voice deserves to be heard." That afternoon, Lena stood in front of a small gathering of parents and children, her heart beating fast. Robbie stood nearby, giving her a small nod of encouragement. She took a deep breath, the autumn wind ruffling her hair. "I wanted to say thank you," Lena began, her voice steady, "for standing up and making sure everyone feels like they belong. I know it wasn't easy, but it means everything to me." The crowd nodded, and some parents smiled at her words. Lena felt a warmth in her chest, a feeling of being seen, heard, and valued. As the meeting continued, Lena joined her friends in a game of tag. The playground that had once been filled with tension now echoed with laughter and playful shouts. Robbie tagged her on the shoulder, and she spun around, chasing him with a grin. The weeks turned into months, and Lena's life continued to blossom. The playground was no longer just a place filled with memories of hurt. It had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Robbie and Lena's friendship grew stronger, built on a foundation of trust that had been tested and restored. One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Lena sat on the swing. David joined her, his larger frame dwarfing the seat next to hers. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice warm and filled with pride. Lena looked out at the playground, now bustling with children who played without a care in the world. The laughter was pure and the air felt different, open and full of possibilities. "Better?" she said, smiling. "Much better," David nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "Good. You did well, Lena." The sun cast its golden glow over them, and Lena felt the last weight of the past lift from her shoulders. The world around her was brighter, filled with laughter, hope, and the knowledge that she belonged. And in that moment, she knew that things really would be okay.